The road into the village was not on any map. There was a path, yes, a narrow track, half swallowed by moss and thyme, but it was not one that carts traveled or that travelers remembered after leaving. It threaded gently through hills veiled in mist, between trees that leaned inward like watchers, their bark furrowed like the brows of elders. The wind there did not carry messages from the world beyond. It whistled with its own mind, whispering to stones and foxes and weathered fence posts. Few knew of the village called Bellmare, and those who did often weren't sure if they had dreamt it. On that particular morning, one neither warm nor cold, but suspended in the kind of hush that cradles old places, a figure walked the path alone, a traveler without hurry, cloak dusted with the memory of rain, boots soft with the wear of long wandering. They did not come seeking anything in particular. Only a feeling, perhaps, a sense of stillness, a pause from the clamor of the waking world. Bellmare, if it existed, had a way of calling softly, like the distant chime of a bell under snow. The traveler paused near a gate that wasn't locked, though it creaked like it hadn't been moved in years. Ivy clung to it like sleepy hands. Beyond lay the first of the houses, stone cottages folded into the earth, like they had grown there, roofs sagging slightly under the weight of their own memories. A cat watched from the sill of a crooked window, eyes the color of old parchment. There was no one on the street, but the village didn't feel empty. It felt waiting. The bell tower rose near the village center, not tall but proud, its bricks laced with lichen, its windows blind with age. At the top, the bell hung in silence, dust coating the metal like frost. It had not rung in generations, they said. Yet some swore they heard it at dusk. The travelers' footsteps made no echo. Even the birds seemed reluctant to speak here. And so the village revealed itself, not in noise, but in textures, the rustle of dry herbs in hanging baskets, the faint warmth of sun on ancient wood, the whisper of lace curtains shifting in windows, as if someone had just left the room. They passed a fountain shaped like a sleeping lion, dry now, but once fed by mountain springs. Coins still glinted beneath the waterless stone, wishes made by those long gone or never known. A shop sign hung by a single hinge, Ives and Daughters, books, bottles, baubles. The windows were fogged from within. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of pages and dried time. A clock ticked somewhere, slow and unsure of itself. The shelves curved inward, heavy with leather-bound journals, blue glass vials, and wooden carvings of animals with too many eyes. The kind of place you could spend a day without ever noticing time had passed, if it passed at all here. A voice came from the back, not startled, merely expectant. "You're early," it said. The traveler didn't reply right away. They only tilted their heads slightly, as though weighing the voice against the silence that had welcomed them. An old woman emerged, short and stooped, her shawl woven with scenes from fairy tales no one tells anymore. Her eyes were clouded, not with blindness, but with memory. "They always come in the fall," she murmured. Not quite to the traveler. When the shadows begin to lean east, the traveler looked toward the window. The trees did, in fact, lean slightly eastward, or perhaps that was just how the light fell. The old woman offered a wrapped parcel. "It's for the tower," she said, as if explaining the weather. "The bell dreams better when it's fed." The traveler accepted it without question. In Bellmare, it seemed, questions dissolved before reaching the lips. Outside again, the wind had shifted. The village was not larger than before, but it felt deeper, as though more layers had unfolded while they were inside. A new path now led behind the bakery, where chimneys smoked with no visible fire. They followed it. At the end of the lane stood a boy with a wooden bird on his shoulder. He was carving something into the wall of a house, with a dull knife, a sigil shaped like a spiral eaten by ivy. "Are you here to ring it?" the boy asked, not turning. The traveler didn't answer. "No one ever is," the boy said, "but they always do." Then he stepped aside, revealing a narrow stairwell descending under the house. It wasn't there before, that much was certain. But Bellmare had no use for certainty. The stairwell breathed cool air, scented faintly of copper and lilacs. The traveler descended, carrying the parcel. Down they went, past faded murals of birds, with lanterns for eyes, past cobwebs that glowed faintly in the dim light. Time thickened here. Footsteps slowed, not out of fear, but reverence. They emerged in a circular room, stone walls wrapped around a brass pillar etched with names, hundreds of them. Some were scratched through, others shimmered faintly. The bell rope hung in the center, tied in a knot no one had touched in ages. The parcel the traveler carried pulsed faintly, as though warm. They set it beneath the rope. It gave a sound like an exhale. Far above, the bell stirred. Just once, not a chime, but a breath of metal. A sigh, as if remembering. Outside, in the village square, cats looked up. Curtains trembled. The clock in Ives and Daughters ticked once and stopped. Time, in Bellmare, had taken notice, and so it began. It was not a sound that echoed. The sigh of the bell was subtler than that. It was the kind of resonance one felt in the chest, behind the eyes, in dreams not quite remembered upon waking. The traveler remained in the circular chamber beneath the house, the parcel unwrapped at their feet, though they hadn't untied it. The cloth had parted on its own, as if the contents wished to be known. Inside had been three things: a feather made of beaten copper green with age, a small glass orb filled with pale smoke that coiled and twisted as if alive, and a folded scrap of paper, yellowed and trembling slightly in the still air. The writing on the paper was not ink, but thread, tiny black stitches forming the words. "Do not ask the bell who you are. It will lie in the language of dreams." The traveler read it once, then again. Something about it felt familiar. Not the words, but the shape of them, like a lullaby from a life that never happened. They tucked the note into their coat and picked up the copper feather. It was warm, not from the air, from within. And when they held it near the stone wall, the etched names shimmered faintly. One in particular, Kakail, letters so faint they might vanish if you blinked. The traveler did not blink. Somewhere far above, the bell moved again. Not a full ring. No, just a creak of ancient weight. But it was enough. Enough to send a ripple through the village, like wind across tall grass, enough to wake the sleeping things. At the edge of Bellmare, in a cottage overgrown with silver-thorned vines, a clockmaker stirred in his chair. He had been asleep for 40 years. The hands of the clocks on his walls all turned at once, as if synchronized by something older than gears. They spun in silence, for none of them had ticked since the last bell tone. When the sigh came, the clocks exhaled, and the dust lifted from their glass faces like breath on winter air. The clockmaker rose slowly, his bones remembering the shape of movement. He adjusted his glasses, which had fogged from disuse. Then, with surprising ease, he wound the great orrery in the center of the room, a celestial machine that hadn't moved in half a century. Planets made of brass and bone began to turn. The stars in the ceiling above them flickered once. The bell was remembering. Elsewhere, in the forest that bordered the southern edge of the village, where the trees grew in spirals, and the moss hummed faintly when touched, a woman stepped barefoot from a stone circle. She had no memory of walking there, only that the wind had changed, and so she had followed it. She wore a cloak of moth-woven silk, and a crown of twigs that bled sap when the moon was high. As she looked toward the bell tower, she whispered, "They've come." The trees tilted ever so slightly toward her, as if nodding. The bell tower did not loom. It waited, and those who had slept, in memories, in stories, in the forgotten breath between seconds, were beginning to stir. Back in the circular chamber, the traveler traced the name again, Kakail. The glass orb in their hand began to shift. Inside it, the smoke had formed a spiral, the same spiral carved by the boy into the wall above. The bell rope, still untouched, began to sway. Just once. Then the chamber grew quiet again, the kind of quiet where breath feels too loud, and even thoughts seem to echo. A deep, suspended quiet. The traveler looked up. There was no visible opening above, yet the faintest light dripped down from the unseen bell like melted gold. It did not illuminate so much as reveal. On the walls now danced faint impressions, moving images, like memories played on vellum, a woman lighting a lantern at dusk, A child placing a coin in the dry fountain. A figure with no face weeping beneath the eaves of the clockmaker's shop. The bell was not just a bell, it was a keeper, a witness, a container of time too dense to flow. Above ground, the village was stirring. Not all at once. Bellmare was a gentle place, but in layers, like sediment rising slowly in a shaken bottle. Shutters opened without hands. Footsteps echoed where none walked. The cat in the window turned and spoke to the air, in a language known only to those who dream in sepia. And from the west, past the stone bridge, with ivy for rails, came a woman in green. She carried a walking stick, carved with moons, and the names of birds long extinct. Her eyes were cloudy, but not with age. She had heard the bell, and she had waited for it all her life. In the shop of Ives and Daughters, the old woman, who had not moved since giving the traveler the parcel, smiled faintly. She turned one page in her ledger, revealing a line written in fresh ink. Kale, returned. She nodded once to herself, and whispered one thread tugged. The rest will follow. Behind her, a shadow leaned forward from the shelves. It was shaped like a person, but shimmered like fog on glass. The shadow said nothing. It simply listened. Night came early to Bellmare, or perhaps time had folded just slightly. A crease in the cloth of dusk. Lamps lit themselves, casting soft orange halos on the cobblestones. The bakery chimney released a sigh of flour and smoke. In the tower, the bell glowed faintly, pulsing in time with something unseen. And in the chamber below, the travelers sat with the orb cradled in their palms. They did not sleep, but the bell did, and it dreamt of a village where time was no longer afraid. The traveler did not sleep, but something inside them softened, like an old knot loosening beneath warm water. They sat in the chamber, with the orb in hand, watching the smoke within shift into forms. Wings, waves, windows opening into impossible skies. Time, down here, didn't move forward. It curled. At some point, whether minutes or lifetimes later, the copper feather twitched gently beside them, just once. A breath of motion in a room, otherwise still, then a soft sound like fingers brushing velvet. A second name shimmered on the stone wall. An ideal, no memory surfaced with it, only a sound, faint as wind in a flute, that rose into the silence and drifted upward toward the sleeping bell. The travelers stood, copper feather in hand, and turned toward the stairs. When they emerged above ground, the world had changed. Bellmare had grown. Not larger in space, but richer in presence, like a melody repeating itself, but with more instruments joining in. The cobblestones shone faintly with dew that hadn't fallen. Lamps flickered with soft hues, not gaslight yellow, but pale greens and twilight purples. Leaves rustled overhead in a rhythm that didn't belong to wind, and the air, it had texture, like velvet stretched across a harp string, thick, but humming. In the square, where the dry fountain stood, 3 crows had gathered, not calling, watching. They wore rings on their feet. One hopped forward and dropped a strip of fabric at the traveler's boots. It was part of a map, brittle and sun-faded, showing a winding path into the woods to the east, marked with a symbol resembling the bell tower. The traveler knelt and picked it up. On the back, written in a spidery hand, "Not all pieces can be returned, but some still wait to be found." The crows did not wait for thanks. They flew off toward the rooftops, perching on the highest point of the bakery, staring eastward. Near the tower, the woman in green had arrived. She leaned on her carved staff, tracing invisible patterns in the dirt with the tip of her boot. Around her neck hung a key, rusted, intricate, shaped like a crescent moon, with a hollow center. She did not knock on the tower door. She simply was, and the door knew it. It opened with a slow groan, revealing the spiral stair leading up toward the bell. She stepped inside, and as she did, the chimes on her staff began to whisper. Names, half heard, places that no longer appeared on maps. As she climbed, she hummed a lullaby, known only in Bellmare, a tune children never remembered learning, but always knew how to sing. Meanwhile, the boy with the wooden bird had returned to the sigil wall. He was no longer carving, but painting. a strange silver pigment that glowed faintly in shadow. Around him sat a group of children, silent and attentive. Each held a stone shaped like an ear, and they pressed them to the ground. "They're listening," the boy said to no one in particular. "The deep roots, they remember before we did." One of the children, a girl with hair like frost and freckles, like spilled ink, whispered, "What if they don't want to remember?" The boy's expression was solemn. "They don't," he said. "But it's too late now." The bell moved, and the roots, far below, began to tremble. Inside Ives and Daughters, the old woman had set out a tea service. She poured 2 cups, though she remained alone. Across from her, the second cup steamed, untouched. She spoke to it softly. "They're beginning to arrive. Not just the traveler, the others." The steam curled into the shape of a moth, then vanished. She nodded to the empty chair. "If you see her, tell her, the key is still here. I never gave it away." On a small table nearby sat a brass box with no hinges, no latch, just a keyhole shaped like a star turned sideways. It pulsed once, quietly. The traveler walked the streets of Bellmare, feeling the memory of the village brush against them, like hands searching for something long lost. They passed a music shop with no instruments inside, only silence, bottled in glass and labeled with names like "The Last Rain," "Laughter on the Bridge," and "Farewell at Dusk." Each bottle glowed faintly when held. They passed a garden, blooming in the shape of forgotten words, flowers curling into sigils that faded when read aloud. A woman tended it with gloves made of lace and shadow. They passed the inn, where the sign read "Only," and a keeper greeted them without speech. Only a bow and a gesture toward a table, covered in old letters addressed to names no one used anymore. And finally, they arrived at the base of the bell tower. The woman in green was waiting. She looked at the traveler, not with surprise, but recognition. "You've changed," she said. The traveler tilted their head. "Do I know you?" The woman smiled gently, sadly. "No, but I knew the one you were, and I think they left something behind." She reached into her cloak and produced a lantern made of ice. Inside, a single flame danced, unfazed. "This is yours," she said. "You'll need it to speak with the bell." The traveler took it. As their fingers closed around the cold metal, the bell high above gave its first true sound. Not loud, not sharp, just a single mournful tone. A note that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The village held its breath. Somewhere a mirror cracked. In the woods a deer turned to stone. In the clockmaker's home, all the clocks ticked forward once, and in the chamber below the tower, the names on the wall shifted, not erased. Rewritten. The traveler looked up. The lantern in their hand flared. The bell was no longer sleeping. It was listening. The door to the tower stood open, not just physically, though the iron-bound wood now hung silently ajar, but spiritually, as if it had consented, as if the act of waiting had ended, and something older than the village itself had exhaled and said, "Now." The traveler stepped forward, lantern of ice in hand. It gave no heat, but the flame inside danced eagerly, casting refracted light across the stone walls of the entryway. Dust hung suspended in the air, glittering like the remnants of broken constellations. The spiral stair began immediately, coiling upward like the inside of a shell. It was narrower than it should have been, the kind of architecture built more for memory than for bodies. Each step worn down not by footfall, but by time itself. A softness to the stone, as if it had been climbed more in dreams than in waking life. The traveler did not hesitate. Up they went. Each step taken was a step inward. The first curve of the spiral revealed murals etched into the wall, faded, but still moving faintly, like light behind frosted glass. They showed scenes the traveler did not recognize, but which felt disturbingly familiar. A procession of masked figures carrying small bells tied to their wrists. A child kneeling at the base of the tower, offering something unseen to a shadow shaped like a tree. A person, faceless, hand raised, standing beneath a blood moon sky, as the tower split open and released birds made of ash. The traveler paused. The lantern flickered. The ice around its base had begun to grow tendrils, crawling, crystalline fingers stretching toward the wall. The murals rippled. Then the wall spoke. Not with words, but with sound, a tone, low and layered, like dozens of bells ringing backward through a cavern. It resonated in the ribs. The traveler's name flickered on the edge of memory. Kale, or was that someone else? They pressed onward. At the second turning of the stair, the air grew thick with scent, wax and parchment, lilac and rust. The flame in the lantern dimmed slightly, as if bowing its head. Here the walls were lined with niches, small alcoves, each holding a relic, an hourglass, with no sand, only smoke, a crown made of nettles and mirror shards, a quill made from a bird that never lived, resting in an inkpot that wept when touched. Each one radiated a quiet hum, like a chorus sung beneath the skin. The traveler paused before one niche in particular, a small velvet-lined cradle containing a music box carved in the shape of the tower itself. They wound it, gently. No melody played, but the stair around them changed. Suddenly, it wasn't stone beneath their feet. It was wood, damp and warped. The smell of salt filled the air. They had not moved, and yet they were no longer in the bell tower. The stair had become the deck of an ancient ship, moored, somehow, in moonlight and fog. The sea below shimmered with stars, rather than waves. Figures moved in the mist. Sailors with hollow eyes, cloaked in ropes braided from hair and ink. One of them reached out and touched the traveler's shoulder. "You carry the flame," the voice rasped, not accusing, but reverent. "Then you must climb. Before the chime forgets you." The traveler blinked, and they were back in the tower. The stair beneath them was stone again, the air thick with candle smoke. They hadn't moved, and yet everything had shifted. At the third curve, the woman in green waited. She was seated on a stool that hadn't been there before. Her eyes were closed, and she was humming, the same lullaby from the woods, only now it sounded slightly off-key, like a dream remembered incorrectly. The traveler approached. "You've stepped into the bell's memory," she said without opening her eyes. "It's showing you its dreams. Be careful, it doesn't know the difference between what was and what could have been." The traveler crouched beside her. "Why me?" She opened her eyes. "Because you're not whole. The bell answers best to the broken." The traveler didn't argue. Somewhere inside, they knew she was right. "You'll reach the bell soon," she said. "When you do, don't ring it with your hand. Ring it with your memory." She pressed something into their palm. A ribbon, frayed and sun-faded. On it was embroidered a sigil, a spiral inside a bell, inside a sun. "You gave me this," she whispered, "a long time ago, before you left." Then she was gone. No sound, no shimmer, just gone. At the final turn of the spiral, the stair became glass. The traveler looked down and saw nothing. Not the lower tower, not the earth, only stars. Endless, wheeling stars beneath their feet, as if the tower floated in space. Above them, the bell loomed at last. It was enormous, hung from beams carved with names and dates, most of them too old to read. It did not shine. It absorbed light, matte and velvety, like storm clouds before rain. The bell rope hung down, swaying gently, and beside it, suspended in the air, floated a mirror. The traveler approached. The mirror did not show a face. It showed a moment, a scene in motion. A small child running through a golden field toward the tower. A woman calling after them, voice broken with fear. A sound like thunder, like laughter, like the bell splitting the sky. The traveler reached out. Their fingertips touched the glass. And suddenly, they remembered. They were Kale. Not the name given at birth, but the one that mattered. The name spoken beneath the tower once, long ago, when they had offered something they could not get back. They had been the bell keeper, the last one. They had chosen silence, to keep the village sleeping, and now they were back, not to wake it, but to ask it if it wanted to be woken. The bell pulsed. It was not time yet to ring, but it knew Kale, now, and it opened to them. The flame in the ice lantern flared, then extinguished itself. The silence that followed was not empty. It was ready. The bell did not ring. It breathed. As Cadiel, the traveler reborn in memory, stood beneath it. The tower shifted, not with stone or structure, but with meaning. The air thickened, gravity frayed. Sounds became slow and elongated, like vowels stretched through water. The mirror cracked, not with sound, but with a sigh, and from its broken center, light poured, not blinding, not harsh. A gentle, golden pale light, soft as candle wax, thick as fog. It reached for Cadiel, not to burn, but to invite. The moment their hand brushed it, the bell's dream swallowed them whole. There was no sensation of falling, only forgetting. First their fingers, then their name, then the concept of days. And then, like a lantern flame in a deep forest, something returned. A scene. They were a child again, or almost. The field stretched endlessly before them, full of tall gold grass that whispered with unseen voices. Wind blew in loops, not in lines, and above, the clouds spelled names they had not yet learned. Ahead stood the tower, but it was different. Whitewashed and clean, its bell freshly cast. It shone. They ran toward it barefoot, feeling the earth remember them with each step. And beside the tower was a figure in red, wearing a crown made of wheat and twine. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their shadow reached toward the child, as though asking for something. "Will you carry the silence?" the figure asked. The child, Cadiel, nodded. They had always known this was coming. The figure in red handed them a vial of dark water, and a small bell, bound in red thread. "Drink when you forget," they said, "and ring only when you remember." Then the tower bent forward, like a flower, and swallowed Cadiel whole. The dream shifted. Cadiel was older now, apprentice of the tower, keeper of the chimes, student of the old tones, a language of resonance and rhythm, of emotion made audible. In the dream, lessons came as sound, a sigh echoing through pine trees, the thrum of moth wings near candlelight, the hush of a name whispered through soil. Each sound was a letter, each silence a page. They remembered their mentor, a woman with hair like woven straw and hands stained with soot. She had said once, "The bell is not a tool, it's a wound. You don't ring it to speak, you ring it to heal." Cadiel had believed her, had promised to keep it quiet, until the village was ready again. But time had frayed, and readiness never came. Now in the dream beneath the bell, Cadiel saw Bellmare frozen in a moment. People paused in mid-step. The cat, leaping between rooftops, hung in the air like a note yet played. The bakery smoke coiled upward, and stopped, still but alive. They walked through it. The bell allowed it. Each villager stood like a statue, not dead, not sleeping, but held, to spend it in the moment, just before forgetting. Cadiel touched one, the boy with the wooden bird. The dream cracked again. Now they were somewhere else. The library beneath the hill, shelves curved like ribs, books chained not with iron, but with hair. Lamps burned oil, made of dream milk. They walked slowly between the aisles, recognizing nothing and everything. A book opened itself. No title, just a single page. On it, a name they hadn't heard in years. Anadiel. A page turned. A sketch of two children, one with a lantern, one with a crown of moths. Another page. A tower falling, ringing, rising again. Final page. Just the word return. Cadiel woke into another dream. They stood now in a garden of bells. Hundreds, maybe thousands, all hung from trees, fences, fingers of old statues. Some were large enough to walk through, others fit in a locket. None were ringing. At the garden's center stood the figure in red, now veiled, voice muffled. "You sealed the village," they said, tone not accusing, but weary, "to protect it. But you sealed yourself too." Cadiel looked around. The bells did not chime, but they watched. "You must choose again," the figure whispered. "Open the door, or let the garden sleep forever." Then the real bell, the one in the tower, pulsed again. It was calling Cadiel back, calling them upward, outward, toward waking. The bells in the garden rustled. The dream began to unspool like thread, soaked in wind. Cadiel whispered to the figure, "What happens if I ring it?" The answer came not in words, but in sensation. Things return. Not always the right things, but always what was owed. Cadiel woke him back in the tower. The dream withdrew like a tide. leaving behind wet sand and the bones of memory. The mirror was gone, the rope hung still, and the bell pulsed once more. Not sound, not yet, but wait. Outside, the village clock ticked once. The bakery fire roared without spark, and from the southern woods, the trees leaned forward again. Bellmare had heard the dream. Now it would decide whether to remember it. When Cale stepped down from the final stair, the village had changed. Not in shape. Bellmare still nestled itself in the valley, like a cat curling into sleep, its houses shoulder to shoulder in quiet conspiracy, but in texture, in weight. The light itself had grown denser, like rain that hadn't yet fallen. Shadows had begun to stretch before dawn, and in the deepest pockets of silence, one could hear something, not quite voices, not quite music, an echo. It came from nowhere, and yet it carried something familiar, a lullaby never sung aloud, the creak of a door never built, the sigh of a friend forgotten too early in life. The bell had not rung, but it had remembered, and in doing so it had blurred the line between waking and dream. The cats were the first to notice. Their pupils widened as if gazing into midnight. They prowled the rooftops and fences with rigid tails, eyes fixed on corners that hadn't existed before. One by one, they began to gather at the square, circling the dry lion fountain, their tails brushing against stone, against air, against possibility. The air near the fountain felt thinner now, as if it had forgotten how to carry scent. Birds flew over the square, only to dip away mid-flight, disoriented, and in the cracks of the cobblestones, small flowers began to bloom, but not the kind that rooted in soil. These petals flickered with light, and the leaves whispered in Morse. Cale stood at the edge of the square, the ice lantern still cold in hand, its flame no longer lit, but somehow aware. Its surface reflected things not present. A child running backward through time, a hand reaching from a puddle, a house being built in reverse. The flame inside had turned violet. From the south came footsteps, not just one pair, many, and then, emerging from the tree-shadowed road, like thoughts surfacing from a dream, came figures, familiar, unnamed, dream-worn. The first was the clockmaker, younger than Cale remembered. His apron was spotless, and in his eyes burned the logic of hours not yet past. Behind him walked the baker's wife, whose house had long been boarded up. She was humming a tune that only birds knew, and her hair was braided with spun sugar. Then the old librarian, the one whose tower fell 100 years ago. Her face was cracked like porcelain, but her steps were steady. She carried a stack of books, written in wind. None of them spoke, they only gathered. The villagers, those living in the ordinary sense, emerged slowly from their homes. Some gasped, some cried, some knelt without knowing why. One man whispered, "That's my brother, but he's young. He died old." A girl stared at the baker's wife and said, "She taught me the names of clouds. I thought I imagined her." Cale stepped forward. The echoes watched them with eyes made of memory. Then one, a boy with a wooden bell tied to his wrist, stepped toward Cale. He held out a mirror shard, no larger than a coin. Cale took it. Their reflections stared back, but behind them in the glass stood the figure in red. "I'm not whole," Cale whispered. The boy nodded once. "Neither is the bell," he said. In the woods, the trees began to bend inward, not collapse, bow. Something old was rising from the deep root of things. The spiral pattern carved by the boy had begun to glow on the stone walls, not with fire, but with breath. The villagers could feel it. The ones who had stayed, the ones who had never left. They looked to Cale, not for answers, for permission, to remember. From the top of the bell tower, a low vibration began. No sound, just pressure, like a heartbeat growing aware of itself. And from the eastern road came the final piece. A child, no older than 7, barefoot, hair tangled with feathers, eyes wide with recognition. They walked straight up to Cale and took their hand. "Are you ready to ring it yet?" the child asked. Cale shook their head. "Not yet." "Good," said the child. "Then there's still time to ask it why." That night, the village did not sleep, not for fear, not for worry, but because sleep had come outside, into the waking world. Dreams began walking. Not monsters, not horrors, memories. The garden behind the inn bloomed with letters never sent. The bakery's oven baked pastries, shaped like the thoughts of those nearby. A staircase in the well led downward into childhood, and above it all, the bell glowed. Faintly, softly, alive. Back in Ives and Daughters, the old woman closed her ledger. She turned to the shadow that had followed her for years, the one shaped like her lost sister. "She's remembering," the shadow whispered. The old woman nodded. "They all are." And she lit a candle, made of snow. Cale stood at the lion fountain. The crows circled above, each carrying a strip of the old map. When they landed, the pieces joined. Not into geography, but into a letter. Folded, addressed. To the one who stayed behind. Cale opened it. Inside, in their own handwriting, a single phrase: "Ring it only when you're ready to become part of the dream." Cale smiled. And for the first time in many lives, they wept. Not from grief, from recognition. The letter burned, without flame. As Cale stood at the lion fountain, the parchment dissolved between their fingers, but as blossoms, tiny petals of language, each one a word they had once spoken in childhood. The petals floated upward, caught in a wind that seemed to come from below, and with that, the soil remembered. The cobblestones beneath the travelers' feet shifted, not broke, not cracked, shifted, like breath turning over in sleep. Moss pulled back, roots stirred, and from between the stones, something reached up. Not a plant, not a hand, a spiral, etched in green. The same sigil carved by the boy, painted in silver, reflected in mirrors, written on ribbon, now blooming from the ground itself. The village gasped, and not with fear, with recognition. Elders fell to their knees, whispering prayers they hadn't spoken in decades. Children tilted their heads, hearing lullabies carried on winds with no direction. The cats froze, ears back, watching the spiral, like it might speak, and it did, not aloud, but inwardly, a pulse through the bones, through teeth, through memory, a message: come below. The bell did not grow alone. Cale followed the path as it unfolded. Each step forward peeled Bellmare further open, like a fruit ripening too fast. The cobbles bent into a downward slope, leading past homes that now stood doubled, once in the present, once as memory ghosts, layered behind them. Windows showed scenes that hadn't happened yet: a child dropping a stone into the well and pulling out a bird, a man playing a flute made of salt, a woman planting thyme itself beneath her garden herbs. The wind changed direction 3 times in one breath, and somewhere in the sky, the moon blinked. Cale's path took them past the inn, and where the innkeeper now stood outside, holding a jar. The jar pulsed softly. "What is it?" Cale asked. The innkeeper looked up, eyes shining. "A silence I've been saving." He handed it over. "Use it only when a question refuses to answer itself." Cale took the jar. It was warm, and inside, impossibly, something curled, something alive, something small and dreaming. Beyond the inn, where the cobblestone ended, was a door, set into the ground. No hinges, no knob, just wood that smelled of cedar and smoke, and carved into its surface, the bell, the sun, and the spiral. Cale knelt. The copper feather, carried since the beginning, glowed gently. They placed it into a groove in the door's center, and it melted inward like a key made of memory. The door sighed, opened, and below, not dark, light, they descended. The passage wound not like stairs, but like tree roots. Walls pulsed faintly, covered in the veins of long leaves. Glowing mushrooms, shaped like words, bloomed from cracks. Insects with clock hands for wings darted past, ticking softly, and through it all, that echo again, not sound, memory, replayed, looping, whispering names. Anil, Cale, Doma, Saul, names no one spoke aloud, names that had been buried beneath the bell. The air thickened. Each breath brought a taste of old parchment and rose hips, the scent of rain on windows that no longer existed. And at the bottom, they found it, the hollow bell, not metal, not forged, grown. It sat in the center of a vast root chamber, a bulbous petal-shaped cavity where time had forgotten to finish itself. Roots coiled around it like lovers. The bell was shaped like an hourglass turned upside down, made of wood and bone, its surface covered in fingerprints. It pulsed, once, and Kale fell to one knee. Visions came fast, like shutters snapping open. A child burying a bell seed under the full moon. A tree growing with chimes for fruit. A fire swallowing the old library, while the roots whispered, "Not yet." A woman splitting herself into shadow and silence to save the village. A bellkeeper, Kale, sealing the tower, the town, and the truth in one final tone. When the visions ended, the hollow bell had changed. It was now open. A mouth, a memory, a wound. Kale approached. Inside it, suspended in golden sap, was the original bell's tongue. The clapper, carved of obsidian and wrapped in twine, made of silver hair. A voice echoed behind Kale. The figure in red. "You planted it," they said, "when you could not ring the old one." Kale turned. "Why don't I remember doing that?" The figure looked at them sadly. "Because some sacrifices eat the name of the one who makes them." Kale wept again, softly. The figure placed a hand on their shoulder. "Now you must choose. Ring the hollow bell, and remember everything. Or leave it, and let the dream go quiet forever." Kale reached into their coat, removed the jar of silence, unscrewed the lid, and let it drift through the chamber. Everything stilled, even the roots, even time, and in that hush, Kale whispered, "I'm not afraid to remember anymore." They reached forward, touched the clapper. The hollow bell sang, not loud, not piercing, just true, and in that moment, the earth listened. Part 8 will return to the surface, where the ringing has begun to rewrite the village. The villagers and echoes begin to merge, the sky fractures, and Kale must face the truth of Aniel, and the price of memory restored. Shall I guide us into the next ripple of the dream? The hollow bell's voice was soft. Yes, but it did not stop. It moved, not just through the chamber, but up through the roots, through soil and stone, into the belly of the tower above and across the streets of Bellmare, threading itself into chimney, soot and tea steam, and the wind that rustled the eaves. It did not sound like a note. It sounded like the moment after someone forgives you. It was what a home sounds like when it remembers you're still alive. Above ground, the first to feel it was the boy with the wooden bird. He had been drawing spirals in chalk on the walls of the inn's cellar, waiting for something he didn't know how to name. When the bell's voice reached him, he froze. The chalk snapped in his hand. His mouth opened, but no sound came, only tears. The bird on his shoulder stirred. Its eyes blinked open, and in a voice not its own, it said, "The keeper has returned." At the square, the lions of the dry fountain opened their eyes. Water spilled from their mouths, clear and cold and laced with starlight. Coins in the basin glowed, each one pulsing in time with the bell's quiet song. The cats hissed and backed away, but not from fear, from reverence. The bakery's windows steamed with new symbols, ancient and curling, written in flour and flickering like candles in wind. And the people began to change, not in body, in presence. The echoes, those who had emerged from the bell's dreaming memory, shimmered. One by one, they began to fuse with the living villagers, some by recognition. A daughter stepping into the memory of her lost mother and finding both hearts beat the same. Some by grace, a blind man holding hands with his childhood self and gaining not sight, but clarity. Some simply by standing still, letting the memory and the moment weave together like ivy around stone. It wasn't fusion, it was reunion, and still the bell rang, or rather sang, a song with no words and no ending, echoing across streets that now had 2 shadows per lamppost, across trees that now held nests built from letters never sent. In the sky the moon split, not broken, divided. One half stayed silver, the other turned gold, and between them, a bridge of thread-thin stars arched over Bellmare, dripping light like spiderwebs soaked in dawn. The cats walked it first. Of course they did. Then the crows. Then the children. At the heart of the square, Kale emerged from the cellar of roots. Their hands glowed with the residue of memory. Not fire, not light, but something that made the air ripple around their palms. People stared. but not in shock. In welcome, the woman in green stepped forward. You rang it. Kale nodded. It asked me too. She tilted her head. And what did it ask in return? Kale looked down. The copper feather, now burned to ash, rested in their pocket like a forgotten apology. It wanted to be remembered, they whispered. Even if it meant remembering the pain. The woman placed her hand over their chest. And what about you? Kale didn't answer. Not with words. Only tears. This time quiet. And not lonely. The echo of Anna Ale returned, as the bell reached its third cycle. It came first as a whisper in the wind, a laugh shared between birch trees, and then slowly as a shape. She emerged from the bakery smoke, barefoot and draped in morning light. Kale turned, and the world stopped. Anna Ale, she looked younger than Kale remembered, yet older than time allowed. Her eyes held forests. Her fingers remembered lullabies. She stepped close, and when she spoke, it wasn't just to Kale, it was to the village. You buried me beneath silence, and I was grateful. But now the dream is waking, and I've come home. The villagers gathered. No one moved. No one dared break the hush. Kale stepped toward her, reaching out, but stopped just short. I don't know if I can forgive myself, they said. Anna Ale smiled gently. That's not what I came for. She leaned close. I came to forgive the bell. At that, the final sound rang. Not from the bell. From the soil. A low tone, the sound of grief unfolding like a flower. And then stillness. Above, the sky began to rain, but not water, petals. Each one bore a name, thousands of names, drifting slowly, tenderly, onto rooftops, into teacups, across empty beds. Some names had never been spoken. Some had been forgotten before they were ever learned. And in that rain, the people of Bellmare began to speak again. Names long buried. Stories half remembered. The kind of truths you can only say under moon bridges. In the hush, after bells. Kale and Anna Ale stood at the fountain. Their hands touched, not to hold, but to honor. And then, together, they turned toward the tower, where the true bell waited, not asleep, not dreaming, but awake. The tower waited, not as a structure, as a threshold. The village lay behind them, soaked in petal rain and lullabies. Its rooftops, glistening with names, returned to them at last. Lanterns burned with memory instead of oil. Footsteps rang softly, as if walking on paper. Even the wind had quieted. Not still, but reverent. Kala and Anadil stood before the bell tower's door, side by side, hands nearly touching. They were no longer strangers to it. They were keepers. Together, the old wood door that hadn't needed hinges in years opened without a sound. The stair beyond was aglow. No torches, no lanterns, just the bell's light, streaming downward like fog turned gold. Each step up the spiral was no longer an ascent, but a recollection. And as they climbed, the tower returned their memories piece by piece. A moment under starlight, sharing bread beneath an unfinished roof. Anadil humming to a cracked jar, coaxing a flower to bloom in winter. Kalo swearing the oath of quietude, tears on their tongue. The pact, made with the village's dreaming roots, to silence the bell so the pain would sleep. The moment Anadil chose to stay behind, so Kalo could forget, and the bell had held it all. Not with cruelty, with love. They reached the top. The bell, the true bell, hung suspended in a cradle of vines, turned to metal. Its surface was no longer dull. It shimmered faintly, as if painted in water and light. Etched around its rim were words in a forgotten tongue. But as they approached, the symbols rearranged themselves, folding like paper birds into meaning. What is remembered can be forgiven. What is forgiven can be healed. What is healed can be sung. Anadil stepped to one side of the rope, Kalo to the other. The rope itself was no longer rope. It was thread, woven from time, grief, laughter, and the quiet between heartbeats. It waited for them to hold it, not with force, but with intention. Kalo looked at Anadil. Are you ready? Anadil nodded once. No, she said, but we go anyway. Together they pulled. The bell rang. Not once, not twice. It rang through the world. The sky peeled open like parchment, soaked in honey. The stars blinked and rearranged. forming constellations shaped like spiral sigils, moth wings, hands held across time. The moon bridge burst into petals. Every home in Bellmare glowed softly from within, not lit by fire, but by memory made kind. Below, the people felt it. A weight lifted that none of them had realized they carried. They wept in gardens. They laughed in cellars. They danced in bare feet down the middle of the street, guided by rhythms older than music. The bakery baked loaves, shaped like bells and hands. The cats stopped mid-prowl and purred in unison. Children climbed rooftops and shouted the names they'd seen falling from the sky, as if speaking them might plant something new. And from the forest edge, the trees bowed, their branches bent toward the bell tower, and something unseen, something ancient, bowed back. In the tower, Kale and Anadil stood with tears on their faces, but they were not sad. They were known, and the bell, for the first time in an age, fell silent, not because it was sealed, but because it had finally been heard. There was no applause, no trumpet, no celebration in the way cities might celebrate a war's end or a harvest return. Only stillness, and then a single voice from below, a child's. Tell us the story again. And someone, a grandmother, or a ghost, or a stranger who had once been a friend, sat on the steps and began, long ago, in a village forgotten by the world, but never by the wind. There stood a bell that could dream, and the story began again, not as repetition, as ritual. Anadil turned to Kale, brushing a tear from their cheek. The village remembers now. Kale nodded. But do we? Anadil smiled. Enough. And then they descended the spiral, hand in hand, not to end anything, but to begin again, as keepers, as storytellers, as people who had once been forgotten by time, but never by love. Bellmare did not wake all at once. It unfurled, like dew rolling off a leaf, like the first sigh of bread rising in a clay oven, like the hush of snow before it touches the ground. The bell had rung, yes, soft, vast, and eternal. But its song didn't vanish. It settled into stone, into skin, into the heartwood of every crooked fence and fog-smeared window. Time had returned. But it no longer moved the way it used to, not in ticks, in tales. Each home told its own story now. The windows of the apothecary fogged, not with steam, but with visions, brief glimpses of who once passed through and who might yet return. Bottles glowed faintly when touched, whispering lullabies from decades ago. The bakery offered loaves shaped like dreams, spirals and eyes, moons and bells. When broken, some let out steam that carried voices. Some turned to petals after the last bite. One child bit into a crescent roll and heard the name of their great-grandmother, spoken in the exact voice she'd used on rainy days. No one questioned it. It was just what happened now. The old well sang, not with water, but with hums. Soft notes that echoed the last thing whispered into its mouth. A traveler dropped in a pebble and heard the voice of someone they'd lost say simply, "I remember you." The traveler wept. The well didn't judge. And the tower waited, not idly. It had become a kind of heartbeat, always present, even when unnoticed. Children were told that if you lay flat on the village green and placed your ear to the ground, you could hear the bell still ringing, not in sound, but in memory. And if you listened long enough, it would tell you a story just for you. Some did, some heard silence, but no one left unchanged. Kale and Annalel stayed in the old bell-keeper's cottage, once sealed, now blooming with forget-me-nots and creeping time. The place no longer smelled of dust, but of lavender and old paper. Annalel painted with mud and light. Kale kept the tower's rope coiled like a sleeping serpent, resting now, after so many years. They tended the quiet, as others might tend a garden, not to keep it empty, but to make sure it welcomed what came. A new tradition formed. Every 7 days at dusk, the villagers gathered in the square. No one planned it. It simply became. People brought things they no longer needed, scraps of lace, old journals, stones with initials. They placed them at the base of the fountain, where the lions now purred instead of roaring. Then they lit a single candle and told one story. Each time, a different voice. Each time, a different truth. Some were short, My mother never learned how to write, but she taught the bees to spell my name in pollen. Some were long. When I was young, I walked into the woods to meet my shadow. It asked me to trade places. I said no. It still thanks me. Some were songs. Some were laughter. Some were lies. But all were kept. The fountain glowed faintly afterward, and the names on its rim rearranged themselves. Never the same. Never forgotten. At the village edge, a new path opened. No sign. No marker. Just a gap in the trees, where fog lay thick and still. Children called it the soft road. They said it led to places that hadn't happened yet, to stories not written, but dreamt. And sometimes, just sometimes, someone returned from it, carrying a new word, a new truth, a piece of the bell in a way no one could see. One afternoon, a girl climbed the bell tower alone. She was small, freckled, eyes full of questions. Annalel met her at the second stair. "You came to ring it?" Annalel asked. The girl shook her head. "No, I came to listen." Annalel smiled. "You already are." They sat together for a while, said nothing, until the girl leaned in and whispered, "Did you love them?" Annalel blinked. "Who?" "The bell." Annalel laughed, quiet and kind. "Yes," she said, "I still do." Later that night, the wind carried petals through the windows, not from any tree. From the sky itself, soft paper-thin blossoms, printed with phrases only visible in moonlight. You were always more than you're forgetting. The bell sleeps better when sung to. Not all silence is empty. Kale stood outside the tower, watching the petals drift. Annel joined them, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, made from threads pulled from old echoing dreams. They didn't speak, they just listened. To the quiet, to the slow, deep settling of a village that had finally remembered itself without needing to hurt. And beneath their feet, the bell sang only once more that night. Not to summon, only to thank. Long after the bell's soft chime had woven itself into the breath of Bellmare, a new sound began to stir in the places just beyond, in the hills that dreamed in fog, in the river that sometimes ran backwards, in the forests where no path ever stayed the same twice. This sound wasn't the bell itself. It was the echo, a ripple, a feeling. The kind of hush that falls when a story you've never heard makes your heart ache like you always knew it. And far, far from Bellmare, in corners of the world where memory had gone brittle and forgotten places curled like burned paper, people began to stir. Not many, not all at once, but a few. The first was a cartographer. He lived in a town so dull that the church bell rang only on accident, and the most exciting thing was the annual goose parade. But one morning, while charting the shape of a stream that had moved overnight, he found a spiral carved in stone. It hadn't been there the day before. When he touched it, he felt something bloom in the back of his skull, a wordless longing. That night, he dreamed of a bell tower wrapped in ivy and mist, and a village where silence didn't mean absence, but safety. He packed nothing, only followed the wind. The second was a girl who painted with moths, or tried to. She lived near a salt lake, where the sun bleached bones and stories. She spoke to birds that didn't exist, and collected broken timepieces, because she said they held unfinished hours. One afternoon, a flock of crows landed in her garden. Each one dropped a feather. Together, the feathers formed a map. No names, only a path drawn in loops and curls, ending in a symbol shaped like a bell inside a spiral. She kissed her grandmother goodbye and vanished before sunrise. These weren't the only ones. Here and there, across the quilt of the world, it happened. A baker in a storm-tossed harbor found a name etched into the crust of every loaf. A boy who could never speak woke with a phrase written on his tongue. "The keeper is dreaming." A lost monk heard the rustling of leaves and turned to find pages from a journal he had burned, blank but still warm. Each of them followed. No one asked where they were going, only why they waited so long to leave. Bellmare received them not as guests, but as returns. Not all of them stayed. Some wandered the village like echoes in a mirror, brief, vivid, and gone by dusk. Some stayed just long enough to remember something they never lived. Some planted things, words, gestures, seeds. A pair of twins from the north left behind a flute that played only at sunrise. A woman from the sea carved a bench near the well. No one ever saw her sit on it, but whenever someone did, they remembered the smell of a place they had never been. The spiral path at the village's edge began to shift. It no longer led only to the bell tower. It branched, forked, wove through dreams and old thoughts, bending the shape of Bellmare itself. New rooms appeared in old houses. A barn opened to reveal an observatory, full of stars that didn't match any known sky. A mirror in the bakery's cellar reflected not the present, but possibility. And at the farthest edge of the village, where the trees once stopped, something new began to grow. A second tower, not as tall, not as old, but singing quietly to itself. One night, Cattle stood in the doorway of the bell tower, watching the mist roll in with visitors in its folds. They held no lanterns. Their steps made no sound, but their eyes glowed with remembrance. Anil joined him, leaning against the doorframe. "Do you think they understand it?" she asked. Cattle nodded slowly. "They don't have to. The echo's doing its work." Anil looked at the sky. The split moon remained, its two halves turning slowly around each other, like dancers in a long-forgotten rhythm. And from it now hung strands of light, thread-fine bridges glimmering into stars, as if Bellmare itself had sent letters into the cosmos. "Where do they go?" Anil whispered. Cattle smiled. "Anywhere someone forgot how to sleep." And so Bellmare changed. Not quickly, not loudly, but like a tide returning to a shore that hadn't known its name. Stories began to leave the village, written in the footsteps of travelers. Some whispered them to trees. Some carved them into boats and set them afloat on cloudless nights. Some simply held them close, like a song without words, and let the story unfold behind their eyes. One story made it farthest of all. It was written on a ribbon tied around a dream bird's foot. The ribbon read, "When the bell sleeps, listen closer. When it wakes, you'll remember who you are." The bird vanished into a crack in the sky. No one saw it again, but some say its song now lives in places without names. In the quiet between ocean waves. In the pages of journals you don't remember writing. In the hush just before your name is called. The spiral path had changed again. It now traced itself through every part of Bellmare, winding across rooftops, down into cellars, curling through gardens where dream thorns bloomed and ink lilies swayed to music no one played. But it no longer marked the way to the tower. It led, now, to the center of the green, to the place where forgetting was to be honored. It had started with a whisper, like most sacred things do. A boy had asked Anatal one morning, while feeding the lions at the fountain, "If we can remember everything, why does it still hurt?" Anatal had knelt beside him, brushing a petal from his hair. She'd said, simply, "Because not all remembering is meant to last forever. And sometimes the kindest thing we can do is let a memory rest." The idea rippled outward, softly, as Bellmare preferred. And by the next moon, the townsfolk were already preparing. They called it the Festival of Forgetting, not because they wanted to lose what mattered, but because they wanted to offer the burden of memory, the gift of release. The preparations were quiet. No drums, no banners, no speeches, only gestures. In the bakery, loaves were baked in the shape of question marks and ellipses. Children wrote their fears on paper that dissolved in dew. Elders gathered in the old apothecary and traded memories like seeds, burying them in the soil behind the shop, where dream flowers would bloom in spring. At the well, a long thread was tied from tree to tree, and visitors pinned slips of ribbon to it, each bearing a word, a scent, a name. At sunset, the thread would be unraveled and allowed to drift down the spiral path into the mist beyond the woods. No one chased it. No one read what was written. The forgetting was offered, not stolen. Kale watched from the tower as the village moved gently through its rituals. He didn't interfere, only listened. The bell, too, remained silent. Its song had become a presence, like gravity or love, always there, no longer needing to prove itself. Anatal joined him just before dusk. She wore a cloak, stitched with pieces of old dreams, squares of cloth, dyed with tears and ink and laughter. "Are you ready?" she asked. Kale nodded. "I don't know what I'll give away," he said, "but I think I'm ready not to carry all of it." As night fell, the village green filled with light, not from lanterns, but from memories released. They rose like fireflies, each one carrying a soft note of story, the face of a friend you never got to say goodbye to, a name you once whispered into your pillow as a child, the feeling of standing on a rooftop at night, thinking the stars were staring back. They drifted upward and were gone. No sadness, only peace. In the final hour, the villagers gathered around the fountain. Each person held a small vessel, a jar, a pouch, a locket, a book with the pages missing. Inside each was something they were ready to release, and one by one, they stepped forward and set it in the water. The lions did not roar. They purred. The water carried the vessels downward, not sinking, not floating, simply absorbing them, like breath into silence. Kale's turn came last. He held a ribbon, no words written on it, just the spiral, drawn in ink, made from bell root and ash. He placed it into the water and whispered, "Thank you for what I had. Thank you for what I lost. Thank you for letting me let go." And the ribbon vanished. The bell tower glowed faintly, only faintly, just enough to say, "I heard you." When it was done, the villagers did not cheer. They did not cry. They did what Bellmare had always done best. They rested. Some lay on the grass and watched the sky crack open, just a little. Some walked home in silence, the kind that doesn't press, but raps. Some sat by the well and sang lullabies with no words. And in the morning, no one spoke of what they'd given up, not out of shame, out of honor. In the days that followed, new things began to grow. A vine that whispered stories only at dawn, a tree whose leaves turned silver when you spoke to it kindly, a garden of bells, each one blooming in a different memory's place. And the people, they smiled more easily, laughed more deeply, cried less often, but when they did, it was never alone. The festival of forgetting became a tradition, not because people needed to forget all the time, but because the act of release became sacred, a balance, a rhythm. The bell rang less often, now, but when it did, it wasn't to call anyone. It was to bless the silence that followed. Bellmare had no clocks. Not anymore. After the bell was unsealed and the tower remembered its breath, time began to move in different shapes. Not lines, not circles, but spirals. Some days felt like whole seasons. Some years passed in an afternoon, and no one minded. They measured the day by the color of the mist, by the taste of the tea, by how many petals fell from the moonthread trees that grew just beyond the green. It was one of those in-between days. Not quite morning, not quite dusk. When Kale stood at the base of the tower, waiting, not with worry, with readiness. Anna was upstairs, speaking softly to the bell. It didn't speak back in words, but it listened, the way rivers do, the way trees might. And a girl was approaching, not a stranger, but new. She had no name. She cared to keep, called herself Echo. She carried a notebook of blank pages, and shoes made of cloth sewn with moth wings. She had arrived weeks ago during the Festival of Forgetting, but had not offered anything to the fountain. Not yet. She had spent her nights walking the spiral path, sometimes forward, sometimes backward. And now, she came to the tower, quiet as dawn, to take her place beneath the bell. Kale met her on the second stair. He didn't speak. He handed her something wrapped in linen. Inside was the copper feather, newly forged, etched with names she had not yet learned. Echo turned it over in her hands, her eyes misted with awe. "What do I do with it?" she asked. Kale smiled gently. "You listen." They reached the top of the tower together. Anna was there, leaning against the inner wall. Her eyes sparkled like quiet stars, and around her wrist hung a ribbon of woven breath. Kale's gift, long ago. She handed Echo a glass bell, tiny, hollow. "Speak into this," Anna said. "Only when the village forgets to feel, it won't ring, but it will help them remember how." Echo nodded. She understood more than she could say. That's why she had been chosen. The bell tower changed again. The walls grew moss, not of green, but of memory, curling like fingers, glowing faintly in moonlight. The stair curved upward into a room that didn't exist before, not for keeping the bell, for holding its stories. Scrolls, mirrors, jars of starlight, feathers turned to ink. Stones with breath caught inside, and in the center of it all, a chair, a desk, a small window that opened only at dusk. It was Echo's, the keeper's new perch, not to guard, to witness. To that night, Kale and Anila sat in their garden of bells, sipping tea made from the leaves of the thyme tree, planted after the first festival. They spoke little. Words had become unnecessary between them. Above, the moon danced slowly between its split halves, shedding soft light that fell in spirals across the cobbled paths. A fox walked by, carrying a scroll in its mouth. Somewhere in the forest, laughter like birdsong echoed through the moss. The village pulsed, gently, alive. Not finished. Never finished. Echo wrote her first entry in the blank notebook. Today I heard a bell cry, not for sorrow, for memory. It remembered the sky before it cracked. It remembered the roots before they curled. It remembered me before I even arrived. She closed the book and placed it beside her on the windowsill. And from far away, someone listening in a forgotten field suddenly felt known as the village fell into sleep. The bell gave one final breath of sound, not a ring, not even a tone, just a warm exhale through time, a lullaby no one remembered learning. And from the well, a ripple surfaced. A name, new and old, whispered just once. Keeper.